Hell is above us. I met my roommate Shannon in college, where we were both in the same section of our program. 2 years later, as our final year neared to a close, Shannon and I started looking for an apartment. Now I lived in residence for the entire time I was at college, and I really enjoyed the community, despite not being a big drinker or party person. I made quite a few good friends, and had no problems getting along with people. I also worked as an RA, residence assistant, where I would help monitor the building, assist with the problems of our other residences, and plan events. Shannon is much quieter than me, and was still living with her parents but looking to move out. We'd both much rather be living in a quiet, family-focused neighborhood, rather than some of the typical grad or college neighborhoods in the area. We both have high standards when it comes to common sense and respect for other people and their space. I had to find a place first, due to a problem with a third roommate dropping out of wanting a place, so Shannon and I had to switch to looking for a 2-bedroom place, and as luck would have it, I found a decent space for just me quickly, and Shannon and I started our search in earnest, knowing that I wouldn't be homeless in a few weeks. By chance, one of our teachers asked me what my plans were after graduation, just 5 days before I was scheduled to move out of res. I told her Shannon and I were looking for a 2-bedroom place, and she surprised me with saying that she owned a property that might work for us. Just 3 days after she told me, we'd schedule an after-work meeting and went to see the apartment. The building is 4 units with 6 parking spaces in front, with a large shed in the well-sized backyard. On the left side of the building are 2 2-bedroom units, one upstairs, one downstairs, with a common entrance. The right side of the building is an exact mirror. You would be living on the right side. Downstairs on the left was a man called Jay and his girlfriend Bev. They also watched Jay's 4 children from his previous marriage on weekends. Upstairs on the left was a single guy, quiet, whose name escapes me right now, as we never did meet him. Both units on the right were becoming available, but we liked the basement one better. There were 2 boys living in our apartment, and 2 girls in the upstairs one. The unit would be available for June, but since I couldn't move again until July at the earliest, we worked something out with Leanne, our teacher, and Chris, her husband. Everything seemed to go smoothly. We got the keys at the beginning of June, and I started spending a little bit of time in the apartment. It was quiet, clean, and I did a full scrub down before moving in, as well as moving some of my knickknacks on my spare time. At this point, Shannon and I were both looking for a job, and I was working part-time. On one trip there, Shannon, myself, and Shannon's father met Brooke and TJ, as well as Brooke's mother and brother. Brooke and TJ would be living above us, as both were starting college in the fall. They both seemed really nice, and had been working full-time after high school to save money for school. They were both 20 years old, seemed normal, and said they didn't party much. Brooke was going to move in first, and then TJ would finish the last month at his job before moving in. We got along with them, and I even got along well with Kim, Brooke's mom. Having been an RA, I recognized the signs of a mom who was worried about her baby moving out, and reassured Kim that it was a good neighborhood, and that we had been in the city for a couple years, and could show Brooke anything she needed. Kim even gave me her cell phone number just in case, as Brooke was prone to losing her phone, keys, etc. Shannon and I both assumed this was typical mom concern, and reassured her. Brooke moved into the apartment, and all seemed to go well. TJ was moving in at the end of the month when he finished his job back home, and until then, Brooke would be alone in a strange city. Shannon and I both offered that if Brooke needed something or just wanted to hang out, she could come see us and we'd be happy to help. That was Saturday. On Sunday, day 1 of Brooke being alone, she locked her keys and phone in the apartment. That was a common mistake, and so Shannon and I helped her break into the apartment with a butter knife and some skills. On Monday, we heard the first crying freakout. She and TJ were having a fight over the phone, and we heard screaming and crying for 3 hours. On Tuesday, Brooke came downstairs again. I was home alone, and she seemed upset. She didn't want to talk about it, but asked if she could borrow my phone to call her mom, because she and TJ had had a fight. I didn't tell her that, we had heard the fight and offered my Skype instead of my phone because my Skype was unlimited Canada and US calling, and my phone doesn't do that. I brought my laptop upstairs and set it up in her living room, and she called her mom. When she came down an hour or so later, she seemed much calmer, said thank you, and gave back my laptop. I happened to look at the call history on Skype and noticed that she tried to call 911 unsuccessfully. I don't know why or what happened, but I could have told her that Skype won't make emergency calls like that. If she had really needed to call 911, I would have loaned her my cell phone, but she never talked about it, and there was a call to her mom's phone for about an hour. When Shannon came home, I told her and we both agreed. Poor Brooke was having trouble settling in. For the rest of the week, Brooke continued to borrow our butter knives when she locked herself out of the apartment, fought with TJ on the phone in huge, screaming and crying fits, and then accidentally broke her new phone and would ask me to use my Skype to call her mother. She once even tried to climb in her much too high bedroom window by taking everyone's recycling bins and stacking them together. Both the neighbors and we caught her and asked she put the bins back. She also tried to call 911 on my Skype several more times, but never made mention of this when she was giving my laptop back. I felt horrible for her at this point and really worried. She was my age and clearly struggling with being on her own. On the following Monday, I received a phone call from Kim. She wanted to let me know that Brooke would be moving back home as she wasn't ready for college and had broken up with TJ. She thanked me several times and assured me that Brooke would be alright. That Wednesday they packed up and moved her back home. TJ moved in on schedule and seemed like a good guy. He didn't party much, and when he did was reasonable about it. We were friendly with him, saying hi when we passed each other and offering suggestions of place he could go in town. It was just generally nice in the apartment, and that should have been the end of it, but it wasn't. As TJ couldn't afford the apartment on his own, he started looking for a roommate, and decided the best place to do that was on Kijiji. It was all downhill from there. In August of 2011, Shannon and I had gone for a walk around our neighborhood, as there are quite a few old homes in the area we wanted to take some pictures of. We started heading back home just as it was getting dark, and there was still some daylight when we arrived home. TJ greeted us in our shared entranceway and introduced his new roommate, who he found online on Kijiji, Brandon. Brandon was about 250 pounds, white, and 26. He wore a baggy shirt, had a shaved head with head tattoos on it, several more tattoos on his arm, and was wearing a huge gold chain with a bulky ornate cross on it. Now we're from Northern Ontario. We don't have proper gangs or gangsters here, so it's more comical than anything else to see someone else dressed as if they are from the hood. Brandon seemed like a really nice guy. We shook hands and introduced ourselves, and he said he wanted to get to know the other people in the building. As such, he invited us out to the backyard with TJ and our other neighbor Jay. Remember, the Toronto drinking age is 19, so we're both of legal age and more than willing to meet the new neighbor, as we too wanted to have a good relationship with them. Brandon, as we found out, was divorced and had a 4-year-old son, Aiden, who lived with his mother, Jen. He'd been living with his new girlfriend, but she kicked him out, and he needed a place quickly. Eventually, we went into Brandon and TJ's apartment. Remember, this is just above our own apartment. Jay went home, as he was going to have his kids the next day, and Shannon went down to our place to catch some sleep, since it was getting late. I was still used to working nights in res at this point, so I said I was up for another drink, and grabbed another one of my coolers, and went to hang out with TJ and Brandon. After about half an hour, TJ was tired, and he too went to bed, leaving Brandon and I in the living room. Now, before anyone gets their hopes up, he never once made sexual advances to either of us. I'm pretty good at picking up signs, and I wasn't ever concerned about him sexually assaulting me. Brandon started to open up a lot about his life though. talking about a lot of details about his divorce. In the span of just an hour or so, I found out a ton about Brandon's life story. He'd been using drugs and not a very good person when he met and started dating Jen. They got married. When she found out she was pregnant, he joined a rehab program the day Aiden was born and had been clean of drugs ever since. After his divorce, he'd suffered from depression and got into a very bad relationship with a girl, Karen, who turned out to be a bipolar and extremely abusive towards him, eventually kicking him out of his own apartment and essentially making him homeless. He moved in with TJ because his 30 days at the local shelter he was staying at were up and he needed to move somewhere ASAP. I'm extremely open-minded and by chance had actually done some research on how differently abuse is portrayed when it comes to males and females, trying to be the good ear for Brandon to talk to, as he was clearly a little bit tipsy and still upset about his breakup. I listened to him talk about how he used to bring her presents of jewelry and take her out to fancy dinners with the money he'd earned working as a contractor, and she was never pleased with him at all. Instead, he'd come home to find her in bed with different guys, and she'd tell him that he wasn't good enough for her and make him sit and listen as she fucked these guys in his apartment, in the bed he bought them that they were supposed to be sharing together. Eventually, one night, she threw him out of the apartment and chucked his things off the balcony at him as he tried to reason with her. He really seemed to worry that he'd ruin things with his wife by not supporting her, and then when he tried to support his new girlfriend, she'd taken advantage of him. It was a bizarre story that seemed like something out of a movie. I mean, like, really? A child, divorce, drug addiction, bipolar abusive girlfriend who took all his stuff and he's only 26. Holy shit. Then he switched tracks and started to get really sad. He was talking how much he'd given Karen and how she'd taken all his money and things like that. He started talking about the good times in their relationships, how both were big fans of the Twilight movies and went to see them in the theater together several times before she had gone off his meds. At this point, he started to act a little weird and was more than a little drunk, so I said goodnight. Brandon thanked me for listening and apologized for ranting so much. I said it was okay and went back down to my apartment. Shannon was waiting on the couch when I got home. She said she hadn't actually been tired, but thought that Brandon was way oversharing and it made her uncomfortable. I told her everything he told me since he'd overshared a lot more when we were alone in his apartment. We both promised to keep an eye out for him. We eventually became friends with Brandon over the next 2 or so months, and he settled down. He was very clumsy though, and would often trip on the stairs coming in and out of his unit, which would result in a huge crash in ours. As we got to know him more, his life story became more and more insane. His family was upset with him for getting divorced and had taken Jen's side in the situation. He'd had cancer caused by the drugs and was receiving treatment for it. His pets were all at his father's house. He told us a story once about how he'd rescue his one dog in Kingston after he found her tied under a porch, with the harness cutting into her since she was a growing puppy. He'd stolen her and then paid the owner $500 to not take her back. We actually saw the scars on the dog under her front legs and on her chest and thus believed him. I never saw anything else though. Every once in a while, Brandon would come downstairs, upset about his life, and we'd sit and listen to more of his stories about snakes and all that stuff too. Of course, his tales got more and more insane. He'd also want favors all the time. $1 here for bus money because he was short, a cup of sugar because he was out, little things that were usually no bother to us. Once we had to watch the dog overnight for some reason, it was at the apartment with him instead of with his dad, when he went to a funeral for a family member. Slowly, we started to get fed up, as he became more and more of a drama queen. Brandon would catch us just as we were going into the apartment and end up crying over how he'd messed up his life, or how he'd come down to borrow sugar, which he did all the time, and end up sitting at our kitchen table crying. Once he sobbed for an hour about how he wanted to be a better father. Aiden would visit on weekends and was a very quiet, well-behaved little boy. I met Jen a few times, and like Brandon had said, she was an amazing mother and just general human being. We had no problems with either of them. TJ, though, however, had not been told that Aiden would be visiting and staying overnight on weekends sometimes, and Brandon started to complain about how TJ was a spoiled trust fund kid, because apparently TJ's father had died after his car was hit by a drunk driver and left him money. He said he had to hide in his room with Aiden so as not to bother TJ, and that TJ never helped out with chores. Shannon and I had never had any troubles with TJ's ourselves. He'd have small parties with a few friends, but they were quiet for college kids. A few times we'd hang out with them, and even got to know his best college buddy Kyle pretty well. Not once did we have a real issue with him. I did sort of understand how awkward it would be, since TJ had never been told about Aiden, and while Shannon and I both really like kids, it would be weird for our college guy who does want to drink and party a little bit to have a 4-year-old kid in the apartment with no warning. We tried to stay out of it as best as possible, though, and seemed to get along with both of them. In November, we found out that TJ would be moving out. He didn't like his program and wanted to switch to a new one in September, but since he didn't have a job, he couldn't stay in the city and was instead moving back with his mother. His last night, Shannon, Kyle, Brandon, TJ, and myself all had a great hangout, which included me driving Kyle's truck even. To get stuff to make nachos at 2 a.m., it was a fun time, and we parted on good ways. December 1st, however, Brandon's girlfriend moved in. Until this point, we didn't know he even had a girlfriend, so it came as a total shock to us. The next 2 months of our lives became some of the most bizarre I've ever experienced. It was just as though TJ was in the process of moving things out that Shannon and I really started paying attention to Brandon talking about his girlfriend. The way he talked about knowing her, it seemed like he'd known her much longer than the short time he'd said they'd been together for, and he always avoided using her name. It wasn't until just a few days before she was scheduled to move in that he slipped up, and I started putting pieces together. He was talking about a specific necklace he'd given to her, and I remember a story that he had told us about his abusive ex-girlfriend. "Brandon," I bluntly asked him, "are we talking about Karen? Are you back together with her?" Since the night we'd met him, he cried dozens of times about how horrible she was to him and how she'd ruined his life. How was he suddenly back together with her? Caught in his lie of omission, Brandon admitted that he was back together with Karen, and that she was on her meds again and had been seeing a therapist. She would be moving in with her son, Izza, who was just a couple months older than Aiden. You have to imagine the sense of dread I was already feeling. I met Karen the first time on the stairs between our 2 apartments on December 1st. She had bright pink hair about to her neck, a bulky winter jacket over a sweatshirt, and PJ bottoms, and must have weighed at least 250 pounds, possibly more. Since August, we've been hearing stories about her and her temper, but she seemed nice enough. I couldn't put this sweet-seeming person with the abusive ex Brandon had talked about. Brandon also introduced her to me as having previously owned pet rats. I myself have 3 rats and absolutely love them, but it's difficult finding people who are aware that they're not just pests or food, but actually very intelligent creatures to make great pets with. We chatted briefly about our pets, and then they went back to moving, and I went down to my apartment. Within 48 hours of Izza and Kara moving in, all hell broke loose. Now Brandon was a huge war buff, and used to watch World War I and World War II documentaries at such a high volume, it was like we were being bombed. We could always go up and knock on the door and he'd apologize, and he turned down the volume. The first argument was a reasonable sort of disagreement between 2 people with loud voices, if I remember correctly. It was about something being misplaced during the move. The second one, we started to really wonder what the hell we were living underneath. For more than a week, we listened to the fight and scream and swear and throw things and smash their way around the apartment. We never so much as seen Brandon frustrated before. So to hear him hollering back at a woman screeching was disturbing. I decided to do something about 2 weeks after they moved in. Karen sounded like she was literally jumping up and down on our heads as she took her usual temper tantrum, and so I sucked up the courage to go and talk with them. In hindsight, I can't decide if it was stupid or not seeing, as I'm pretty sure this woman is actually diagnosed bipolar and seemed to be unbalanced. Now, as politely as I could, I knocked on the door, and Brandon answered looking terrified. I didn't see Karen, but judging from her voice, I think she was inside the kitchen. "Just wanted to let you know we can hear everything that's going on in here when you're loud like this," I said. It's really bothers us when you're pounding like that on the floor." Like I mentioned before now, we had a good relationship with Brendan. He was mopey and used us for favors all the time, but he wasn't a bad guy. Instead of this unearthly screeching, stared from the other room. "Is that the fucking neighbor? I can hear your goddamn fucking club shit music all fucking night. You wake me up at fucking 3 a.m. in the fucking morning. Don't you fucking come in here and say we're bothering you, you little shit." Now, I know exactly whose music it was. A couple had moved in next door in the basement apartment, directly on the other side of our wall. Their names were Ashley and Charlie, and though both claimed to be working full-time, they were heavy smokers and all sorts of things, drinkers, and could party into the wee hours of the morning. We'd actually had problems with them and their sound system as well. Once I'm asleep, I sleep like the dead. I've almost slept through fire alarms, but their parties have woken Shannon up on numerous occasions. We'd also gone and talked with them about it, and they were really, really rude, slamming doors in our face and basically telling us to fuck off. Quite bluntly, I say, "Just so you know, I don't even have a proper sound system. What you've been hearing is the music next door, and we hear it as well. We've complained to them, and to the landlord, and if it's bothering you, maybe you should complain as well. Right now, I'm being bothered by your pounding, so could you please stop?" She started screaming, and actually jumping on the floor then. I was frustrated beyond belief, and went back downstairs to ride out her tantrum. As someone who works in childcare, I can quite easily say that I've seen smaller tantrums from teething toddlers. She was completely unreasonable. They continued to fight like this 3 and 4 times a day. At this point, though, my roommate and I were only working part-time, and thus we'd often find ourselves either home alone or both in the apartment to listen to them. We heard every single fight. I was rapidly becoming concerned with Izza's well-being. I knew quite often that he was at home when they were fighting. Brandon seemed to know the environment was toxic, because his weekend visits with Aiden were shortened to just a few hours. Then one morning, at around 8 a.m., I heard Karen screaming her head off once again. "I don't need your shit this morning. You need to get your fucking stuff straightened out so I can drop you off." I realized that she was shouting at Izza. Now, he was a reasonably quiet child. We never saw him playing outside in the yard, or even heard him when they were coming and going, even though they had been living about us for more than 2 weeks at this point. I probably seen him once or twice. To hear him being shouted at like that just broke my heart. And though I waited to talk to Shannon about it, we eventually made an inquiry with the police, and then a formal report of concern. With the police now involved, the argument settled down a bit, and Karen took Izza to her sister's house for a few days. Since I was working only part-time, and work didn't need me over Christmas, I went to my parents' home for a little over a week. Shannon kept me up to date about the fighting. Apparently Christmas was quiet, but there was a massive blowout on Boxing Day. I came back just in time for New Year's, and Shannon and I had a reasonably quiet night at home, just relaxing and hanging out, since we hadn't seen each other in a few days. We realized that Karen had moved up around mid-January, when Brandon confronted me after work one night. Shannon and I had ordered sushi, and since Shannon walked past there on her way home, she grabbed it. I got home around 5:45 and was expecting her at about 6:20 when I was walking inside. Brandon met me at the front door. I thought to go out for a smoke. He slipped and fell exiting the building and hit his head fairly hard, so I brought him downstairs as he wanted bandages and I had a first aid kit. He was completely unfocused. I'm still not sure if he was high or if he had a concussion. I had a friend get a fairly bad concussion in college when she passed out when she was sick with the flu, and I had helped take care of her. I suggested that he stay sitting down for a while as I cleared off the counters and made room for our takeout containers. He asked if I had some time to take and started full out crying. Karen, he told me, was pregnant with his baby and had gone completely off her medication. The fight over Christmas had been about her physically beating on him until he tried to push past her to get off the couch to cool off outside, and she claimed he punched her in the stomach. Now I know Brandon, and no matter how many times I've seen her scream and hit him, he's never raised a hand to her in even the slightest bit of aggression. He would often cry and plead with her to stop as she was screaming at him. He would have never punched her in the stomach, especially not with her carrying his child. There was a court order between the two of them until their trial. She'd taken Izza to her sister's again and was living there. She'd also told him he would never be able to see the baby. You could tell how much he was already committed to this child. Aside from being a recovering addict and pathological liar, he worshipped Aiden, Izza and Karen, and even his ex-wife Jen. Everyone in his life got so much love that it seemed to physically hurt him. There was even a possibility that she would keep the baby from him was breaking devastating to him. His train of thought then turned to their two cats, Willow and Slayer. They were Karen's cats, and she'd apparently left them because her sister didn't have room at her house. Brandon had found a home for Slayer, but he was having trouble finding a place for Willow since she was elderly. He didn't want to take her to the shelter for fear she'd be put down, and she was Karen's deceased mother's cat. He asked if we could take her, and while I would love to have been able to, I couldn't. First of all, they weren't even supposed to be there in the first place. Secondly, I couldn't afford the medical bills for an elderly pet on my salary. And thirdly, I'm allergic to cats. He was still crying when Shannon got home, and we ended up fixing up our plates around him as he continued crying for an hour or so. He eventually left because our raw fish was grossing him out, and we let him go. At this point, he refused help for his possible concoction, and for us to call him a taxi to go to the hospital. I checked on him the next day and he seemed off. It was around this time that Chris, our landlord, called me. Chris was really worried about the cats, the garbage piling up outside, and that Brandon wasn't the tenant that was supposed to be living in there in the first place, as the tenant agreement was signed by TJ. He'd also not paid rent. I had a long talk with Chris on the phone on my lunch break one day about the fighting and everything, and he started trying to evict Brandon. Brandon agreed to move mostly because he couldn't afford the place without a roommate and seemed to have none of his own friends. The move-out date was set for January 31st. Nothing happened until February 2nd, when I woke up at 6:20 to a bunch of noise. The following is an improvised timeline from that day. Originally, I posted this on my blog, but I've edited it to make it more Reddit-friendly and relevant. 6:20. Smashing and pounding sounds from upstairs, followed by swearing. 6:30. Got out of bed to use the bathroom and grabbed my iPod from the kitchen. 6:48. Facebook status. Woken up by psychotic screaming from upstairs. 6:50. Facebook status. He's at the bloody door pounding. Please go away. It's not even 7 a.m. yet, and I'm done with you. 7:35. Give up on sleeping and turn on my computer. Listen to music with headphones in. 9:15. Finally decide it's been quiet enough and open the living room blinds. See Karen, who I've been told was legally not allowed to be on the property. Promptly go back to hiding. 10 a.m. Shannon wakes up, has conversation about what the fuck is going on. 10:30. Shannon looks out the window to see police car. Asked if I called. Police come to the door. I opened the door and told them that Karen was upstairs, and they gave me a really weird look. Stumbling and confused, I asked were they not up there because she wasn't legally supposed to be on the property. Find out that apparently the door was kicked in upstairs, and Brandon was assaulted by 4 or 5 guys. Tell the police we only heard him up there and no strange sounds. Explain that it was common to hear him fall down the stairs, but that the pounding was weird. Shannon and I are asked to give a statement once they investigate. 11 a.m., police come back and ask if we can give a statement at the station. Ask permission to get changed out of our PJs. As Shannon and I both had the day off, police go back upstairs while we change. 11:30, get driven to police station in back of police car with Karen, who was also going to give a statement, as Brandon had called her saying he'd been stabbed. The police drove him to the hospital, and he had indeed been stabbed 3 times in the stomach. This was obvious by the blood in the entranceway and outside the door. 11:50 to 12:40 p.m. Give statements explaining to officer our relationship with Brandon and how he has been since he moved in. 12:56. Shannon gives in to give statements. Text Chris and Leanne because this is insane, and as landlords I felt they should know that the police had the apartment marked as a crime scene. 1:12 p.m. Shannon back out, got a call from Chris asking what the hell is going on. 1:20 p.m. Get ride home from police officer. When we got home, we found out that the upstairs apartment was a taped off crime scene, and though we'd been told that we would be able to put Willow back, we couldn't. They told us to call the station in a few hours if they didn't give us a call then, but asked if we could hold on to her. If no, then she'd have to take into a shelter. We had no food and no litter box, though I managed to make one quickly with the bottom of my small rat cage, and some of the bedding I used in the bottom of their cage, since it's just technically recycled paper petted cat litter. At this point, I posted more stuff up on Facebook, and our neighbor Tanya, who lived in a house next to our building, mentioned that she would be willing to take the cat, since Brandon had been trying to get rid of her anyways, and we were good friends with Tanya. We called the police station back at around 5:30 p.m. At this point, it was dark outside. The police told us that Brandon was to have no contact with us and that he would be staying somewhere else. They said that we could put Willow back, but at this time, Tanya was worried about us and said she'd come get the cat. We went and had supper at Tanya's with her husband and son, and then when Chris came around 7:30, she walked us back home and made sure we all had her numbers just in case. We snuck downstairs, lied to Chris, and said that Willow had gone out because we didn't want Brandon going over to Tanya's house, and then hid in our apartment while Brandon collected his things and was driven away. Chris changed the locks right then and there and said he would be back with his truck the next day to move the rest of Brandon's things out. He would bring Brandon with him, and then a neighbor on the other side of the building, Jay, had said that he and his girlfriend would do a really good cleaning job. We'd seen the blood on our side, outside, and in Brandon's apartment. But we didn't know that Brandon had gone over to Jay's side as well, and bled over there as well. Brandon moved out quietly as we hid in our apartment and waited for it to just all be over. We told Chris that a neighbor had taken the cat in, and Brandon agreed that this was for the best, though we never spoke with him and would have had no contact with him again, as the police told us to call them immediately if he showed up on the property or tried to get a hold of us, just in case. When Jay cleaned the apartment, he thought there might have been drugs used, but there were none in the apartment. He did find detox drugs in the fridge, as well as a bloody kitchen knife. It was then we started to put the pieces together. What we think happened was that Brendan started using again and was losing his visitation with Aiden. He tried to clean up his life, but then was getting evicted and panicked. He tried to stage a break-in by pawning his Blu-ray player and stabbing himself 3 times in the stomach, but it backfired when no one answered the door and he had to call Karen. He'd also lied to Chris and said he couldn't move on the 31st because he had fallen off a basket and broke both his knees. This was total bullshit. The last contact we had with Brendan was a mysterious phone call that we thought was a wrong number. Someone had called Shannon's cell in mid-February at 11 p.m. one night and had a very muffled voice. She couldn't understand what the person was saying and told them that they had the wrong number before hanging up the phone. She Googled the number afterwards, and it showed up on a Kijiji ad that she recognized. Before moving out, Brandon had tried to find a roommate and asked Shannon to help him make an ad for one to post. It was his number. Neither Shannon nor I had ever given him our numbers. I saw him briefly once on the bus last summer in June or July, but he made no effort to talk to me and never tried to call us again. The guy who moved in after Brendan bought in bedbugs and was gone in 3 months, and we're currently in a fight with upstairs tenants who live there now. One of them is Ashley from next door over parking, snow removal, noise complaints, her 3 dogs shitting all over the yard, and many other things. Twice she screamed insults in my face and we've called the police. That's a story for another day, though. We're in the process of looking for a new place, because what should have been our perfect apartment has turned into hell.